Size Me, episode 686, brought to you by the amazing Half Size Me Academy. To join us, please go to halfsizeme.com/join. Hello, beautiful listeners. Today we are going to have a fantastic interview with Lyle McDonald. He's been on the show before. He's talked to us about female cycles and weight loss and fat loss, and he has been really helpful. He's great at collecting a lot of information, digesting it down in a way that really is helpful for the general population. And I was privileged to get a copy of his book, The GLP-1 Solution, a complete program to maximize your weight and fat loss results. This book was really nice because actually it helped me see something really clearly, which is one of the reasons I think many of us had a really negative knee-jerk reaction to some of these weight loss medications is due to the past experiences we've had with other weight loss medications. And we talk quite a bit about that in this particular interview. But in this interview, we're going to go through basic things that we've kind of noticed with our own clients, things that he has pulled together research-wise, going into a deeper dive into these medications, what to expect, giving more realistic expectations around the medication. So I think this is going to be a great conversation. And I would highly encourage you, if you're at all remotely interested in these medications, definitely check out his book. It's available on Amazon. It's called The GLP-1 Solution, a complete program to maximize your weight loss and fat loss results. So now, without any further ado, one more thing I wanted to mention. Almost forgot. If you would like to join us in the Half Size Me Academy, we are going to be doing a deep dive into food journaling your way. I have said this from day one, and we even talk about this, Lyle and I talk about this in this particular interview, that I think food journaling is extremely helpful. Whether you're on a GLP-1 medication, whether you're not on a GLP-1 medication, but here's the thing. I don't think that food journaling has to be done one specific way. I feel like you could do paper pencil. I feel you could do calorie tracking. Currently, right this second, I'm doing photo food journaling. There are a ton of ways. Really, the whole point of food journaling is in a world where food is plentiful and it's in very large quantities. It's so easy to overeat. So some type of accountability or self-awareness is a game changer. So if you think, oh man, I've really struggled with food journaling because I have a lot of drama and stories around it, and I think, I'm not good at it, or maybe I'm afraid to try a different method, this would be a great month to join the Academy. That's what we'll be focusing on for the whole month. And to join us, just simply go to halfsizeme.com/join. Now on to my interview with Lyle. You have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon. All right, lovely ladies and gentlemen listening to the show today, we have the awesome Lyle McDonald back on the show. He visited us back in 2018. And Lyle, you've been in production of a brand new book. I got the GLP-1 Solution, complete program to maximize your weight and fat loss results. Yes. I loved reading this. Thank you so much. So kind of, how about this? Let's start out with... I think these medications got a huge pushback from a lot of people because of the previous history we've had with weight loss medications. So when you look at these and you kind of look at, and you went in a great deep dive in your book, by the way, on just kind of, and we don't have to go quite as in depth, but just when you compare these to what has come prior, do you think you kind of know why people would have felt apprehensive and how they might have been confusing these medications compared to those? And could you maybe give us some insights into that?
Yeah, we have a history of a century of, obesity medications in a medical sense, and centuries before that of gibberish. I mean, just when you look at the history of weight loss stuff, because, nobody knew anything about anything. They were throwing everything at the wall and seeing what would stick. But, you go back to the early 20th century, the development of thyroid medications, which were overused. And then you had amphetamines in the 50s. And then we started to get drugs. We had phentermine, which is actually a very old drug. That would, of course, be coupled with fenfluramine in the 1990s. And then we had, there's been all manners of attempts to do that to greater or lesser degrees. Mm-hmm. And most of them, have worked. They tend to have limited efficacy. They usually about 10%. That's about the maximum. And then they just stop working for whatever mechanisms. I think it's just the body adapts. And frequently there were, problems. A lot of them have gotten banned over the years, usually because of all it takes is a few high profile deaths. And frequently when you look into it, it's either not linked to the drug or it's abuse, which is a real problem with all weight loss things. People, they do it with supplements, ephedra in the 90s was the same sort of thing. So we do have absolutely this history of, partial success, somewhat failures with limited effects. And that might be part of the pushback. I honestly think the big part of it is still just the moralistic attitudes that people have, the whole thing that still, unfortunately, subsists and will for probably a couple more decades at least of overweight and obesity being, a moral failing, sloth, gluttony, sort of all of that. This is something that I see certainly in the fitness industry, where you have people who will take 6 supplements or any number of drugs, many untested, to get to their results. But if you take a drug to help you lose weight or keep it off, now you're cheating. That's just a step too far. To me, they're just back justifying a deep down belief that people with overweight and people with obesity are just lazy. They won't come out and say it. I mean, some will. And as much as I disagree with that stance, because we know now there is a distinct neurobiology to all of this in an environment that makes this very difficult. Well, I don't agree with their stance. At least the people who will say it, I can appreciate the honesty, right? I think they're wrong, obviously, but it's the ones who come up. I know, for example, and I won't go too far off on this, a bodybuilding coach. Now, his athletes use 5 or 6 anabolics, any number of untested peptides, and drugs. But he said he doesn't like the GLP-1s because he doesn't want to add to their drug load. Like, really, this is where you draw the line. Yeah. All these other things, or there's not enough research. There's over 2 decades of research on these things. These peptides these guys are injecting, there's zero. The mental gymnastics, the justifications, and so I'm not saying one group is better than the other. I'm not saying GLP-1s are better than what they're doing. That's not my point. It's just this hypocritical line in the sand that they draw. Or, and I know we're going to discuss this. There's another brain surgeon who says, well, I haven't heard, nobody ever wants to talk about what happens when you come off. Right. And I pointed, he goes, you just regain the weight. And I said, well, if you come off your anabolic steroids, you lose your muscle. What's the difference?
Yes.
What is the difference? But again, they're justifying this deep-seated belief that reminds me, as someone who's dealt with my own bipolar and mental stuff, this was the attitude towards mental health in the 50s.
Right.
And the 60s and into the 70s, right? It's just a moral failing. You need to try harder, all that stuff. We have now normalized the fact that mental illness is a neurobiological condition, that medication, which admittedly is overprescribed, can help, but that it's a lifetime treatment in most situations, right? Yeah. We can't fix it yet. Some of the ketamine, some of the psychotropic stuff might. Obesity and overweight now, attitudes towards that are still locked into where we were in the 50s. So maybe in 10 or 20 years, by which point you and I will probably be out of this field. Maybe. And it is shifting among a certain population. Yeah. In the research, then I'll be quiet and let you talk. Sure. They're now recognizing overweight as a chronically relapsing neurobiological condition and recognizing this will require chronic treatment as a chronic condition. And even though you'll regain weight thing, I go, well, if you stop following your diet and exercise program, you regain weight, you're not criticizing that. Like, there's no difference. Yeah. And we know that. So I think it's as much bad past experience. I mean, the first chapter of my book was that weird history to kind of lead in. Mainly, I found a cool paper on it and thought I'd just write it down, if I'm honest. And along with just centuries of moralizing.
100%. And honestly, my eyes were really opened as a coach as I got more and more clients on this.
Right.
And I was shocked to really see the difference between what social media is putting out versus the reality. And I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to kind of expand even more with my knowledge of this, because I think part of the pushback is because if things seem too good to be true, we're really hesitant, like, oh no, this is the sky is falling kind of thing. Right. And what's interesting is there are those social media influencers. They're like, oh, I'm just taking this medication. The weight's just rippling off my body. And I've had women come to me. They're at a pretty decent dose. They're losing 1 or 2 pounds a month. Right. And they're like floored. They're like, why am I seeing all of these people losing this? There's something wrong with me. There's something wrong with what I'm doing. And what I've kind of come to realize, and I like how you address this in the book, is the difference in how people's bodies respond to this. Yes. And that really in of itself, if there is no dietary change, if you're just eating the same diet you were before, yes, you could lose weight, but maybe not the best way. And if you do want to come off these medicines, if that's even in your future, if you don't take this time to alter your habits seriously, you will regain the weight because nothing has changed, right? So could you speak to that, like this misconception that might exist in what you've seen with social media and some of the dramatic results versus what other people might be experiencing?
So I think there's a few things. I mean, I agree with every point you made, but part of the reason I decided to write this book, right? I saw in my Facebook group more and more people talking about them and using them, and I kind of started paying more attention to it. Especially during COVID, we had the big TikTok fad, and people were getting Ozempic who didn't need it, and that prevented the people with diabetes who did need it, because the internet will be seen as a mistake in the future. I mean, I've been on it for 30 years, but fundamentally, the internet was a mistake. But you had sort of these two different versions of it. On the one hand, you had people presenting them as almost magic. And a problem with social media is the people that are talking the most, the people that have the loudest voices and the biggest following, people only talk about the good stuff on social media. Everyone looks at that and thinks, oh my God, everybody's life is perfect and wonderful. And mine, what am I doing wrong? It's like, yeah, because people don't usually go on social media and talk about the day they had where they couldn't get out of bed, right? They only tend to present the good stuff. But so you had that side of it, and that the drugs were magic and you just took them and the weight melted off and this and that and the other. And for some people, that's true. Some people are hyper responders. They get this massive, massive effect, and others get a very little effect. I mean, I had a whole chapter on the variability, which I don't think people have recognized. Then, of course, on the other side, you had all the scare tactic, clickbait reporting on these. Admittedly, there are side effects. Like with any drug, right? Make no mistake. But when you look at the actual number of them, and they're also usually with the older drugs. If you look, stuff with gastroparesis and, gallbladder things, do they occur? Yes. But when you look at the studies, they're like, oh, it's double the risk. Yeah, it's like 1% versus 0.5%. Like, it happens, but that's the nature of clickbait news media. So we had both of these ends of it. They're magic, which they can be for some people, and they're just, death in the needle. And so a lot of the reason I want to do this book was, I do it to learn a new field, but also let's look at it objectively. What does the science actually say? What are the actual risks? There was a whole Ozempic phase, and a lot of that, I still see people, GLP-1s eat muscle. No, they don't. They just put you on a diet, and if your nutrition is not good, you have the exact same that's another real criticism in the fitness industry, that it's true, but it's just diet related. Any bad diet, any poorly set up nutritional diet without exercise causes identical amounts of lean body mass loss. They don't understand lean body mass versus muscle mass to begin with. That's a whole separate thing. But yeah, so we had both of these. Right. So people take them, and I see it. I lurked in a couple GLP-1 groups just to see what people's experiences were. And you would always see that. You would see people go, I can't eat anything. And then you have other people being like, I'm on the 3rd dose escalation and I've lost nothing. And I think the message that got out, as is always the case with these sorts of things, is that, the drugs are so magic that you just take them and the weight falls off, that you don't And make no mistake, that's what pharmaceutical companies have always wanted. They want that you don't have to make those changes, and I get that. Partly it's a practical thing. Partly it's just we know the reality of most people. But yeah, and people are just like, what's going wrong? And the answer is that, well, if you're not a hyper responder, and we don't know why that is the case exactly yet, it just is. There's actually a recent paper that speaks to something that's going on. But if you're not one of those people that at the low doses your appetite's just crushed, you're not going to lose weight simply by dint of being on this drug. There is, even in the early studies with the weaker drugs, people would gain weight, which we've seen with all dietary approaches and all exercise approaches, right? Some people lose a ton, some people lose a little, and that comes down to, well, what's happening with their real world food intake. Yeah. I think the final trap people sometimes fall into, and this is again true of all these interventions. Oh, well, not only is being on this drug mean I don't have to worry about my diet, but I can actually eat worse. I've seen people ask that. You've probably seen it too. I saw someone go, well, if these drugs control blood glucose, does that mean I can just eat more candy? Like, I think you're missing the point of the exercise. Yeah. It's like I worked out, I earned the milkshake mentality due to misunderstandings. So yeah, I absolutely, social media is misrepresenting it on one side, or people don't understand how they work, which is predominantly as an appetite suppressant. It just puts you on a lower calorie diet, except when it doesn't.
Yeah. And I want to throw one other thing I think that fueled that too is, and I don't know if this was something you saw as much, but I would call it dollars for pounds. Like if I'm paying $1,000 a month for this medication, I think it should be yielding X amount of pounds lost, because I'm seeing people on TikTok.
I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think the price point in of itself created a sense of like, okay, wow, if we're being charged this amount of money for this medication, and I'm seeing these people on Instagram and TikTok having these kinds of results, then of course it's got to be magical, right? It's like if I can price it high enough, it makes it kind of like hard to get to. So it's one of those situations where I think the price kind of helped that along.
I don't disagree. I mean, that's true of, there's people take that coaching approach of like, I'm going to try, and some of it's buy-in, but some of it is because you go, well, if it costs that much, it must work. And it does, except when it doesn't. I think adding to that, and then we can move on. This is another reason that I wrote this book, is if you look at the studies, the newer drugs are probably going to be like, they may be magic. They're so much more potent. They're so much more effective. Like the results that they're getting, like that was something else just backing up quickly. While most drugs for the treatment of overweight and obesity stopped at about 10%, as we've gotten into the newer GLP-1s, like liraglutide's still pretty weak. But when you got into semaglutide, you were looking at 10 to 15%. Tirzepatide, which is Zepbound and Mounjaro, 15 to 20%. Retatrutide, which is still in the research stage, they've seen up to 30%. Like we're approaching low levels of bariatric surgery now. We have gotten so far beyond. And this is also, and I'm sure you see it this way, is that this is really the first truly new effective tool that has been developed for the treatment of overweight in decades, like truly that's moved us a step further due to the way that these things are working. But yeah, so the newer drugs will probably make it so that people really don't have to worry about it. Oh, what I was going to say is in the studies, they usually give lifestyle intervention, lifestyle advice. Now, is it good lifestyle advice? No, but when you're doing a study with 5,000 or 6,000 people, there are limits to how much, they also need to keep it standardized because that's science. We give them lifestyle plus drug and we give this group the same generic. I mean, it's super generic, but then out in the real world, and also studies are different. This is something else I think the people you're seeing don't realize. When people enter clinical studies, they often act very differently than out in the real world. A really interesting example to me, even with the side effects, and there are some ranging from, mild to major, only about 15% of people drop out of the studies. But out in the real world, something like 75% have stopped by the year mark. Like they're because I think when people are in clinical studies, number one, there's a mentality of, okay, I've signed up for this and I want to make the guys in the lab coats happy. And they're probably getting the drug for free. And the cost is a big barrier. Yeah. But out in the real world, people are bad with this stuff. People don't like needles. Liraglutide, which was a once a day injection, nobody wants to do that. I mean, we know that type 2 diabetics they need to do insulin injections to live, and they're still often very poor at it. That's why the once a week drugs were so beneficial. Companies are working on a once a month injection. I'm told one of the big companies, they're working on a once a year injection.
Oh, wow.
So, which of course has its own problems, right? Because at least with the short acting, if you get side effects, you can quit and it'll clear pretty quickly. If you've gotten a shot that's going to last a year and it wrecks you, like they're going to have to really solve the side effect profile, because if it's it'll take 2 years afterwards to clear your system. You will be in big trouble. But anyway, so you do see these. So I think you've got people in these studies. They are being given feedback, not only the lifestyle, some diet advice, some exercise advice. They get once a month meetings. That's always been part of lifestyle advice. People aren't getting that in the real world. Not to mention, in this country, I'm told it's different. I did a consult with someone last night who's in the UK, and because of the way their health system works, everybody who's put on these drugs does get lifestyle advice. In the wonder that is America. And trust me, I love this country. But when you can just call up a telemedicine company and have someone write you a script for compounding, I did a very informal poll in my Facebook group and said, okay, who's getting advice? And if so, what is it? And over half, nothing. You get the prescription, go with God. Some people one sent me their handouts, and it was like, number 1 was eat healthily, and number 2 was brush your teeth. Not bad advice, but not particularly useful.
Not helpful.
Right? And I think number 3 was like, get enough sleep. Like, again, not bad advice, but not really. And then every once in a while, I would come across someone who I think was usually in more of a specialty clinic, whatever reason, was getting actually really good advice in terms of exercise and protein and that calories matter. But by and large, so you combine that with people just thinking, oh, the drug will do all the work.
Yes.
And you get much poorer results out in the real world than you often see in these clinical studies.
Yeah. And a lot of the old medications, I kind of, as I was reading through that chapter in your book, I'm like, well, that kind of makes sense to me, because those older medications, a lot of them were, I'm just going to use the word speed for lack of a better medical, a lot of them were something speed up your metabolism. And you kind of got a similar effect. Like everybody got jittery. They could stay up all crazy hours, all this energy, and the weight just kind of came off. Why? Because you were actually accelerating the metabolism via this medication. To your point that you made earlier, this medication is more about appetite suppressant. It's having an effect on the way the brain gets rewards. And so it's not like you shooting this injection into your body is immediately going to guarantee pounds come off your body. And to your point, I just took on a client. She's in her 60s. She's on tirzepatide, and she was given it to lose weight. And I said, well, what's your eating look like? She goes, well, I'm eating about 600 calories a day, and I'm having, and I said, okay, well, what's your protein look like? She's like, well, I'm having salami at lunch, and I'm having peanut butter and crackers. And I'm like, no. Let's do 30 grams of real protein at every meal. That's your job, is to get this protein in. And that, to your point, though, here she's paying $1,000 for this medication. The doctor did tell her to eat more protein, which did not explain to her what that meant what that looked like and how to disperse it through the day. And so now she's paying me as a coach to help her better use this medication in her life. And that, I think, is what's happening. And there was another scare tactic, right? About muscle loss. Well, you're going to lose muscle no matter what kind of diet you go on. If you're eating at a calorie deficit, the goal is to eat differently. And kind of, I loved how you went into that book. Could you kind of talk to that point a little bit, the muscle loss, especially for this demographic, these women in their 40s, 50s, and 60s?
One other point I wanted to make about the expectational weight loss that people often forget is the initial doses are not meant to be effective, and they aren't. Like semaglutide starts at 0.25 milligrams per week. That's to minimize side effects, right? It's not actually because I've seen people in groups, you've seen this, probably seen this too.
Yes.
Well, I took it on Monday and I haven't lost any weight this week.
Yeah.
It's like,
Nothing
sorry.
happened.
I mean, I wish something, but the first month, frequently there is no expectation of weight loss, except maybe in the most hyper. It's really not until even the second dose that some people start to get an effect. And we can talk like, even dose escalation is its own issue that in the studies, they do one thing for control, but that is not how it needs to be or should be done out in the real world. Because people also think, well, if I'm on this dose and I'm losing X weight, well, I should just take the higher dose and I'll lose 2X weight. And don't. But we'll come back to that. So as far as that, hang on, where were we?
We were talking about the muscle loss and the protein. Yeah.
Yes. So all of the early studies showed lean body mass loss. I'm going to be very careful in my language here, and I'll explain the differences. Okay, so in our body, we typically divide things into two components, right? We have fat mass, and that's visceral fat, which is around the gut, essential fat, which is in the brain and around the organs, and subcutaneous fat. That's the majority of it. And then everything else is lean body mass. That's just the simplest model that we use. So lean body mass includes bone, water, minerals, connective tissue, your organs, and skeletal muscle. And actually, fat cells have a little bit of lean body mass, like a very small percentage. The point of this being that all muscle is lean body mass, but all lean body mass is not muscle. Okay, so the studies were seeing varying amounts of lean body mass lost. Now that happens on any diet, right? If I were to put you on a very low carbohydrate diet, for example, you may drop 3, 5, 7, 10 pounds of water in the first couple of days. We'll clear out your gut from all the food waste. That weight loss will show up as lean body mass loss. Is that muscle? No, of course it's not. Right? Only a little bit less than half of lean body mass is actual muscle mass. Right. And there's a lot of those rapid weight loss things where you lose weight real quickly, whether it's, an enema or low carb, or like people like, but I lost 10 pounds in a week. Yeah. And it was very little body fat. It was mostly water and poo, and it would count as lean body mass, but that's not muscle. So people saw that and they were like, oh my God, there's all this lean body mass loss. And then I have seen people confuse those two.
Right.
And go, there was 40% lean body mass loss, 40% muscle loss. No. Now, we've known this is the case with all previous diet interventions over 50, 60, 70 years. It is typically assumed on most diets that you will lose roughly 25% of the total weight as lean body mass, which again is not skeletal muscle. It's a 75-25 rule. It's more complicated than that. The details don't matter. So the most recent meta-analysis of the GLP-1s and lean body mass loss showed an average of 28% loss. Okay. Now, I'm no mathematician, but 25% and 28% seem essentially identical to me. So the GLP-1s are not causing any effect on muscle or lean body mass that cannot be explained by any other low-calorie diet. And again, that criticism, GLP-1s cause lean body mass. Well, so do nutritionally poorly set up diets. What's the difference? But again, people think these compounds have an effect that they don't. They are predominantly making people eat less. If you eat, and what I think part of what's happening, so if you take someone who has, we'll just call it a suboptimal diet initially, typical Western diet, you and I both know, older individuals in general, and I hate to generalize, probably older women more so, are already starting out with probably a less than ideal protein intake. Just because it's an age thing. Men tend to like protein more, whatever. Then you now cut their calories. Well, now they're eating a lower calorie version of that same suboptimal diet. So now their protein intake drops from 50 to 40 or whatever, and they get into problems. And that's why, and I put this in the book, no matter what you do on a GLP-1, no matter what else you do nutritionally, you must get sufficient protein. And there are people in the social media space who are, there's one, a doctor, I want to say Rentia, who's actually putting out fantastic information dealing with these misconceptions and just driving that. Actually, the GLP-1 group I was in, I was really surprised and really impressed. People are like, you must get 80 to 100 grams of protein per day. You must, no matter what else you do. And that alone, and again, we have decades of work on the typical low-calorie diet. Protein intake must go up, and when it does, you may still get the same lean body mass loss. You're going to lose water and glycogen, but that will spare muscle mass. Then if you add some type of exercise, you can get muscle mass, true muscle mass loss to an almost insignificant level. But those things, even in the research, when they're doing, lifestyle interventions, here's the sum total of their advice. Eat 500 calories less, do 150 minutes a week of exercise, unspecified, and then we're going to do a once a week consultation with a nutritionist or a behavior change. That's it. Yeah. That's the same advice we've been giving to people for 50 years, and you and I both know how well that's worked in the long term. Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. Yes, there is lean body mass loss, the same as on any diet.
Yeah.
There is a small portion of that is muscle loss, and it is a small portion. One paper even said, even if we can reduce it by 50%, well, that saves you, that's 1 kilo, right? Or, about 2 pounds, or maybe not even that. They're like, is that even clinically relevant? Yeah. Even with that, there's some evidence. We know that when the development of overweight and obesity, it's a change in what's called muscle quality, and I don't want to get into the physiology of it, but with weight loss, there is an improvement in muscle quality that can show up as lean body mass loss, but it may be beneficial. So there's all these misconceptions about that, but at the fundamental level, it comes down to, as your calories go down, protein intake must go up. And for most people, and then couple that with the point you made, many people have vast misconceptions like, oh, well, peanut butter is a good source of protein. No, it's really not. Yeah. It has a little bit, but when you have these misunderstandings, and I'm not being critical any more than you are, that generation, and I hate to put, I'm 54 now, but I grew up in an athletic subculture. So like that's part of, you've been doing this for a long time. But like you look at an older generation, they didn't grow up in a culture of going to the gym, right? Yeah. It's just not part of their mentality. Eating certain ways, like, oh, protein is bad, and you eat lots and lots of carbs. And that can, even without the GLP-1s, we're finding that older individuals need more protein. Yeah. The GLP-1s make it that much more critical, but that's just not, getting that message out there is very difficult.
Yeah. And that's why I did a recent, I think it was a video or webinar where I was talking about the fact I see these medications now, having been working with people one-on-one and seeing the impact in individuals' lives. Yeah. I see it as, if you get the proper education and coaching with this, it gives you the ability, probably for the first time in your life, to maybe not be hyper fixated on eating all the time. It helps with cravings and things that you might tend to go to, like alcohol. Yep. And it gives you the mental space and clarity to build those habits you've heard everyone talking about for years and years and years. And if we can change our perception of it, is like, we're not paying for pounds lost on the scale with this medication, but we're paying for a timeout to build the habits that will let us lose the pounds on the scale and be ultimately successful with this medication long term. Or if we did titrate off of it, at least give us the best fighting chance with our habits to keep the weight off. And
I've seen a lot of people report that, I'm sure you have too, that have tried for years to do what we've told them. And look, I hate to say this. I did in the book, and people will probably just tell me I'm pandering and pivoting. But like you, I realized this is the part of the future of treatment, and it's the first thing we really had that's effective. But the advice we've been given to people for the last 50 years, in the majority, has failed. Mm-hmm. And the reality is, nothing's going to change. There's no new diet we can try. There's no new exercise intervention we can try. Like, there are new, until this. Like, the reality is that, again, there are groups that have succeeded. We know about the National Weight Control Registry, obviously the message you've been giving out. Mm-hmm. And I know you wrote that excellent book on long-term maintenance, which I've been saying for years is like, that's the hard bit for most people. But we have really fun. But I know a lot of people that tried all that for years, and it wasn't until they went on a GLP-1 that they were actually able to your point, to make those changes. And again, I'll come back to mental health stuff. Like, is therapy critical and useful? Yes, but I know a lot of people that, like, depending on what they're dealing with, they may need a friend. Someone I knew at one point was like, the medication gets me out of bed, because when you're deep into it, that allowed them to do the work. It is not, in that case, I mean, yeah, medication can work in and of itself, but using it to make those lifestyle changes. And I think with the GLP-1s, the message has just become, just take them, and you don't have to. And for some people, it's true. But in the long term, well, to get the best results out of the GLP-1 while you're on it. And again, that's a lot of why I wrote this book, was to get that information out there. Not only get better results in terms of changes in body composition, lose less lean body mass, less muscle, so you don't just end up, as a smaller version of yourself. We know that that's what happens with badly set up diets, and there's lots of them out there. But also to make those lifestyle changes, to facilitate making them, the reduction in food noise, that preoccupation, finally the ability to stick to it. Because if you do ever want to come off, and you and I may differ in this, I know we're going to get to this, some people that may not be realistic to come off completely. It just depends. It depends on what's going on. Probably depends on how long they make. Like, we just know that there's variability in this. But if you want to have an absolute chance of being able to even to taper down your dose, or possibly come off completely, in the studies that saw the rapid weight regain, number one, I think it's pretty safe to say that most people didn't make those. Like, a percentage kept it off, but a majority regained it. But also they stopped the drugs immediately, which also had its own set of issues that we can talk about. But yeah, if you ever want to come off, you want to get the best results and minimize side effects in terms of the gastric stuff and all of that. And I do think, to your point about social media, something that I've noticed in my industry, and I bring up your name all the time in this regards, people that have never been significantly overweight have no perspective on this. Like, I can have it explained to me, but like I've never dealt with that, whether it's the physical issues or the societal stuff and the weight stigma. Like, I've never had, but we tend to be people that, like when I started working out, I loved it. I loved exercise. I don't like it as much now, but that's a whole separate thing, right? I wanted to make those changes. I'm not my target audience.
Right.
And I know that, right? That it's different if I'm working with someone who's a relatively lean athlete versus someone who is dealing with those issues that is associated with overweight, the neurobiological changes, the behavioral, all that stuff. That is a different population. And I suspect and I wrote about this, of course, my book will be the only one you'll ever see that has an appendix on using these in lean athletes, because I know people are using them. Right. And but in my very limited experience, leaner individuals seem to respond to the compounds differently. They whatever it is, different neurobiology, they've already got the habits established. Yeah. That is a very completely different situation than someone with long-term behavior patterns that they're needing to change. Right. And, even when appetite's a little bit suppressed, if you're eating a lot of high-calorie, hyperpalatable, energy-dense foods, it's still super easy to keep calories high. It's super easy. And so I think you've got all these things going on, but
yeah. And one thing I just want to chime in on is, as having been somebody who lost weight without these medications, what I can definitely speak to, and I think really kind of made me more interested in these medications as a solution. And I don't suggest to all my clients to go on them. There are some I will say, hey, based on everything I'm seeing right now, I think you might be a good candidate for this. Yes. You might want to look into it. So it's an on individual basis. Perfect. But when I was losing my weight, I can honestly tell you, I had no clue what real hunger and real fullness felt like when I was at my heaviest. And I don't know if that's because I had so much fat tissue that I was carrying around that maybe hormonally it affected me. And I literally would white knuckle through the day and just try to hold on till tomorrow. And there would be nights I would cry myself to sleep at night, like literally. And it was like going to a boot camp, if you will, like that same experience of how hard it was. But the closer and closer I got to my ideal body weight and getting off a 150-pound person, I started to be able to pick up on those feelings. Oh, wait, I'm kind of full right now. Or, hey, I'm not starving out of my mind. Like when my body weight became what would be more normalized.
Right.
Also, ipso facto, those things did. So I'm thinking for people who would be willing to take these medications at that kind of obesity level, if they're willing to work on their diet and really revamp it while they have that lack of feeling that maybe I struggled with, it could give them a fighting chance that if they could get their body weight low enough, it might actually work out for them to come off the medications possibly.
Yeah. So without getting into like a bunch of scientific nerdery on this, like we do know that there are changes in neurobiology, in brain chemistry that occur with the development of overweight. Now, the question is what's cause and effect, right? Like I think probably what's happening, if you're someone who, when you're younger, has a certain type of reward system, and if you're a super taster, like I've known people that don't like sweets and I just can't understand them, but they can't understand me. Like, who can eat jelly beans? I'm like, oh, I'll show you who. Like, just give me a bag and you'll see exactly. So there are differences there at a very young age frequently. Now, in our modern environment, depending on a lot of factors, that tends to cause the initial weight gain. That starts to cause its own set of problems. Like a paper just came out. 5 days of high calories started to cause insulin resistance in the brain. That means you'll get less of an appetite, a fullness signal, because insulin is involved in that. And one of the new GLP-1s, cagrilintide, is taking that approach. I think it will actually be better for people with type 2 diabetes, which is a whole separate thing. This is all in the book, by the way, if people are wondering why I'm skirting over some of this. And you get all these changes that are occurring. The reward system eventually gets resistant, which is why people have to keep escalating how much they're eating. It's akin to substance abuse, and there are certainly, it's both driving the same system. So you get this feed-forward cycle, but going to cause and effect, chicken and the egg, we also know that as people start to lose weight, these systems do, at least partially, I hate to use the word correct because it makes it sound like, and I used to like defect and dislike. Defect, it's someone that you're not defective, but in a biological sense, there's a dysregulation. A lot of that will correct itself with weight loss. The difficulty, of course, is how do you get to that point, right?
Yeah,
like if you've got a system that is just driving you to, and we are surrounded by food triggers everywhere we go, like sort of speaking to the substance abuse thing, something I've brought up, and this may come across as contentious, but just hear me out. We know that substance abuse treatment and the treatment of overweight has about the same success rates, which is to say it's not as low as people think, but it's not as great as we wish it were. And in a very general sense, it can be somewhat easier to treat substance abuse. So I'm not downplaying the how horrible that is, but you can technically consume 0 drugs of abuse, right? There is no requirement for alcohol or drugs of abuse. Right. Someone in that situation can set up bright line boundaries and not go into a bar, not be around that. You can't do that with food. You have to eat something. We are in a culture, especially in this country, that is everywhere we go, every social event tends to revolve around food and around high calorie, hyperpalatable food. When you've got those biological food triggers and still have a certain and reward system, can you white knuckle through it sometimes? In premise, obviously in practice, it's a lot harder than just going, it's just willpower like that, but then again, frequently the people who are saying this, the hardline bodybuilders and athletes, they just don't leave the house. Like that is not a joke. They literally are so afraid of going out into the real world. Like, okay, tell that to someone who's got a job and a life and a family. But initially you have to get through that early phase to even say the insulin resistance in the muscle. I did a podcast a million years ago for a group of folks that were diabetes, and the hard bit is getting started, right? Diabetes becomes this feed forward cycle that makes things worse and worse and worse. And their goal was, we want to get it on the downslope, right? If it's with diet and exercise, to start to improve insulin sensitivity, improve these systems so that it gets easier over time. So that's exactly what you're getting at. That even if it's just to get people over the hump.
Yes.
To make, because we also know from lots of data that most lifestyle interventions start to lose their effectiveness, or just people abandon them at the 8, 12, 20 week mark if they're lucky. Maybe you look at the GLP-1 studies, and I had the misfortune of reading them all. Like, that's the placebo group loses a little bit of weight, and then they either plateau at the 12 week, and then they start a slow regain. And we know that that's what people do. Whereas the drugs keep things going till at least the 20-week mark, when it starts to slow down, which is something else that doesn't get talked about, is the plateau. But getting people past that initial 20 weeks, we know that longer weight loss interventions are more successful because it gives people longer to build those habits.
Right.
But it's a catch-22. How you go, the longer you stay on your diet, the more likely you are to develop your habits, when most diets fail long before that occurs. The GLP-1 can just get you to that point.
And there's something that I really want to make sure people are aware of, because again, the more I work with people, the more I'm seeing this play out. I think it's a really helpful thing for us to talk about. The medications in of themselves is a process, meaning that we're talking about increasing protein, changing up dietary stuff. That's a process. But then the titrating up on the medication, the side effects that you will experience at higher levels versus lower levels, finding the right level for you. And then the one I found really fascinating is, I think I was listening to another doctor, obesity doctor, talk about this, that right around the 6-month mark, if you've been on the same dose, it's kind of like going to keep you in maintenance versus allowing you to continue without increasing. And I think, kind of circling back to that moral thing that we talked about at the beginning, I think a lot of people are hesitant to increase dose. They want to stay at that lower dose and try and stay safe. And they're not really embracing that this, going back to, it's not an injection, weight just cascades off your body. It's now a titrating up process. And if you overshoot it, you may have to titrate back down a little bit. It's like a dance. Like, that's how I kind of see it. Tell me what your thoughts are on that.
Well, and this is something that, again, what they do in the research and what the message that's has come out into the real world are not the same. And that's a big part of why, so what they typically do in the research is they dose escalate every 4 weeks. Now, liraglutide is different because it's faster acting. They titrate that up weekly for 5 weeks. But if we're talking about semaglutide, tirzepatide, and when the new ones come out, it takes about 4 weeks for those to reach a maximal stable level. So they start with a baby dose, typically, for the first month. There is no expectation of effects at that dose. It is to limit side effects. It is to break people in. There may be some who get an effect at that dose, although I tend to doubt it. And then at the 4 week mark, they escalate to the second dose. So semaglutide goes to 0.5 milligrams. Tirzepatide goes, I think, 2.5 to 5. Like I said, retatrutide's not out yet, but whatever, it'll all be the same. And then you stay there for 4 weeks. And then in the studies, every 4 weeks, they escalate to the maximum dose, depending on what the drug is. But what's lost in that is, if people raise the dose and their side effects are just staggeringly bad, they do let them de-escalate. They will move them back to the previous dose, because it can take a number of weeks through whatever mechanism for some of the side effects. I'm the only one I've ever seen mention that. If you raise your dose and you feel terrible, go back. You're not ready. Even if you're not getting severe big time appetite suppression, it doesn't matter, because it's not worth those consequences. But at the same time, there is no fundamental reason to escalate every 4 weeks. It's far better when someone finds an effective dose. And in the studies, they typically define that as still losing some percentage of weight every week. Stay there. Stay there until it quits working. Because some people, someone that I've consulted with over the years, same thing. They fought with their weight for years, and they went on Mounjaro last year, and they said they were a hyper-responder. They've never gone above the second dose because they never had to. They got lucky. For other people, they may have to reach the highest dose, but you go up when you need to, not simply because you want to. This is, again, something I see among fitness people, because fitness people think more is better. They either want to start at the higher dose, which is a disaster, There's like really no worse choice, or they want to escalate it too quickly. It's like, no, give it a month. It takes a while to kick in. And there was one paper that came out. A lot of this was like towards the end of 2024, that when they let people self-select their dose escalation of semaglutide, they ended up using a significantly lower dose. Like the average dose was 0.77 milligrams, which is 1/3 of what the maximum dose is. Now, that's an average, but the point of this being that get through the baby dose, get through the first month, which is not going to do anything. Then when you get the second dose, if it's effective, stay there. Yeah. If it works for a month, works for 6 months. Escalate it when you need to, not simply because you want to.
So that brings up a really important question I think we probably should talk about, which we really haven't gone into this very much thus far. But I know a lot of insurance providers are requiring people to escalate in a certain time frame. That's what I've been told. Like some of them say, okay, you need to, like for them to get continued coverage of these medications, they have to follow a systematic formula. Is there any idea why that might be the case? Is it just because the clinical trials have shown it that way and they feel like they want, if they're going to pay for it anyway, they want it to be
that one I couldn't tell you. I don't. That's just crazy American health insurance. That one you'd have to ask someone who's involved in that field. But yeah, they're probably going, well, this is how it's used clinically to get maximum results. Because probably their logic is, well, our goal is to get maximum. If we're going to pay for it anyway, we want to get maximum results because we know that there are a lot of comorbidities that occur with the development of overweight and obesity, that they're like, well, if we're going to pay this money on the front end, we want to reduce claims on the back end by improving health. But that is just like, it's a terrible way to do it. That's just as sort of an example. I had a buddy who was a physical therapist and they got bought out by some big company, and insurance basically was like, you got 6 sessions. But not only that, we want to see exacting numerical improvements week to week to week. It's not about treatment. It's about, we want to demonstrate to our investors that the money we're investing is worth the return, because that would be my guess. But I
was just thinking about that when you mentioned the clinical trials. I thought, I bet you that's why, because you were saying that there's like a formula that they have to follow regardless. And so one of the things that I'm also curious or would like to hear your thoughts on, since you've spent so much time researching this, is I'm kind of very concerned about the compounding, only from the standpoint of, one, they're not really being checked, number one. And number two, kind of my understanding of why the compounding can even happen is because of the shortages. And then when the shortages get fixed, those compounding pharmacies may have to go away. So people who are getting this for a lot less might be kind of screwed, basically. That's where we are right now. And that's exactly what happened. So during the 2000s, when there was a shortage of semaglutide and tirzepatide at that time, they sort of allowed the compounding pharmacies to come in. Now, one thing that's not acknowledged is that what the compounding pharmacies are using is not the exact same compound. It's got to do with chemical structure, and it's the acetate version. They run it through. I'm not a chemist, but I know, because people ask her, like, how can there be a shortage if the compounding pharmacies can get it? Because they're not using what's being used in the clinical trials. And actually, just for anyone listening, if you go like to one of these online companies, unfortunately, the nature of American capitalism, people saw money to be made. We saw this in the fen-phen days, right? You could make a phone call to someone, they would just to doc in a box, and you could go, oh, I'm overweight. And they would go, all right, cool, here's your prescription. It didn't matter if you were or not. And that's the nature, because in other countries, this doesn't really happen. But if you go to a compounding pharmacy, legally, they have to say, this is not the FDA approved version of this compound. And if they don't, go elsewhere. Another paper looked at, I want to say, they looked at all the compounding pharmacies in Colorado to see what they were doing. Some huge proportion didn't even make it clear that they were not using the FDA version of it. A lot of them put other stuff in there, B12, B6, and things like that. They claim it's, for energy or whatever, but apparently it's to try to claim, oh no, the FDA laws don't apply to us because we're doing like
That's what I've been told. So people came out of the woodwork, and there are horror stories out there. Yeah. There are people I have heard people are relabeling insulin pens. That could kill someone, right? Oh, wow. Because it's cheaper, right? They just put a label. I mean, it's not only felony fraud by mislabeling drugs, but I mean, if I were going to do it, and I would take bacteriostatic water, throw a little B12 at it, and charge somebody $300 a month for what would amount to a nickel's worth of whatever. So the compounding pharmacies, they've got the issue. They're not using the official version. They're finding that they may be underdosed, overdosed, misdosed, fake. Apparently Australia banned compounding last year because people were like hyperbolically, like they were mixing it up in their bathtub. There are all kinds of toxins. It's not being made. And I'm not trying to scare people off of compounding. I honestly suspect because I've heard people go, oh yeah, I was on compounded this and got 0 results, but I changed to either the real stuff or a different compounding pharmacy. I have to wonder if what they were getting wasn't fake. Yeah. It may not be. And obviously, even in the clinical studies, there's huge variability, but I have to wonder. That happens in athletic subculture. People get, illegal compounds from underground labs, and a lot of it is misdosed or fake or some other compound. But yeah, so in about the last year or so, there has been a big issue in this country of Novo Nordisk and probably Eli Lilly as well. They are not happy with the compounding pharmacies because it's cutting into their profit picture. I mean, that's just what it fundamentally comes down to. And now that the FDA has decided that there's no longer a shortage of semaglutide and tirzepatide, they are trying to shut down the compounding pharmacies. I saw 2 days ago, the compounding pharmacies are countersuing.
Oh, wow.
It's a real mess because the compounding pharmacies may go away. And it is unfortunate because one of the big roadblocks to these compounds, if your insurance won't pay for it, is the price. And, they just made liraglutide a generic, but it's also a very weak drug. Mm-hmm. It generated by itself 5 to 7% weight loss, a little bit more with intensity. I mean, it's better than nothing, but not by much. Semaglutide is better than tirzepatide is currently the best we've got. Retatrutide will stomp these things flat. Its effects are but it's a few years off.
And it's going to be more expensive too, right?
But the only benefit is that may lower the prices of the earlier drugs. Simply, tirzepatide is much more effective than semaglutide with a much better safety profile. Retatrutide is going to be breathtakingly expensive. Cagrilintide is going to be and the stuff we got 10, 20, 30 more compounds, but they're half a decade off. Mm-hmm. It's going to be a while before not to mention, there's just a lot, because it's $1 billion pie. But the people that are using telemedicine are getting compounded versions whose insurance companies won't pay for it. And many won't, because many have not realized that they'll pay for the diabetes version because diabetes is a disease, but they still don't see obesity. I find it absurd because if the insurance companies would sit down with a calculator, they would find that their front end cost on the GLP-1s vastly offsets the claims in the long term of overweight. But that's not how companies in our country think, because it's quarterly investors and it's a bunch of financial stuff. So the compounding stuff, it has allowed far more people to use them. Yeah. But if someone's going to go that route, because again, this comes up in my Facebook group, like if you see some company that just popped up and is like $99 and way cheaper than the rest, run. Yeah. Go stick with one of the we've got Hims and Hers, which has been around for a while, selling. I mean, they started with ED drugs and hair loss stuff, and now they're doing stick with a unestablished company that's been around for a while, because anybody in the US can set up an LLC in a day and start selling whatever they want. And it may or may not be. But it's going to be complicated. Yeah. I fear, I got to think that Novo Nordisk, which is $1 billion company, and Eli Lilly, they're going to have more money to throw at lawyers than whatever companies are, are overseeing that are countersuing against this. So this will be a story in development.
Yeah, and one of the things I wanted to ask is assuming that somebody is listening to this episode and they're like, okay, I've really been fearful of doing this, or I've been putting it off, but I'm starting to see that maybe it could be beneficial for me. I see it as there's all these components that they may want to think about and have some kind of like almost like planned strategy for as they go into using it. Mm-hmm. And that could be like what we talked about, dietary change. It could be just accepting the fact that it's not as clear cut as I get an injection and weight loss happens. Right. Like there's a dance to it. What would you encourage somebody maybe at this stage of life, like I said, 40s to 60s, they're considering it. What would be some things that they could already start to establish now that will be helpful for them, in your opinion, going on these medications?
Certainly, like we talked about. Sorry for interrupting. It's just okay. It is my way. No, I need to be better about that. Certainly, would be the protein intake. And like I said, right. We have immense amounts of data now that older individuals already need more protein intake to begin with, due to something called anabolic resistance. So that alone. I mean, the way I've looked at it for many, many years is if you're looking at weight and fat loss, the deficit in protein intake are primary. The rest of it is very secondary and far more contextual, what people like, exercising, stuff like that. It would be that. One thing that it is tedious and a pain, but it's very useful, especially in the modern era. Like, yeah, it's great if you go on and at the second dose you are a hyper responder. The thing is, you won't know until you get there, right? And if you don't, and even in the research, so some people they claim are complete non-responders, even at the highest doses. And the rule of thumb is if you've lost less than 5% body weight by the 16-week mark, you're not going to respond to the drugs and you should stop, which is all good and well, but that's 4 months wasted. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of that still comes down to, did the person make lifestyle changes? Because I'm sorry, and the studies bear this out, if you make those changes, if you make those, you will lose weight, period. Mm-hmm. Now, you may not lose more than you would have lost with the drug if it were, but it will help you along, right? Mm-hmm. It will make it easier to adhere in both the short and the long term. So certainly protein intake, but for folks that are not hyper responders, and again, you won't know till you get there, it would be a good exercise to go through to actually find out how much you're eating now. Because you and I both know, I'm sure you talk about this, mm-hmm. People's estimates of their calorie intake in the modern era are terrible. Now, I want to make it real clear. I'm not saying they're doing it deliberately, that they're actively lying, that they're any of that. We just know that people are terrible at estimating their calorie intake for various reasons. And everybody, whether they're suffering from overweight and obesity, whether they're lean, registered dietitians are terrible at this. If mm-hmm. anyone should be okay at it, like it is simply part of unless you have spent time tracking. You have, like after a while, you can pretty much eyeball your food intake, mm-hmm. but only after you've done the drill of you gotta track everything. That means if you consume it and it's not water or something non-caloric, you must track it. You should measure it. Back in the day, we broke out the old food counter book, the old calorie counter books. I had one, that thing that was, now we have Fit Day and apps to keep track of these things. You have to measure, because I would ask anyone listening to this, do you know what 4 ounces of chicken is? Do you know what a tablespoon of peanut butter is? Do you know what a cup of cooked rice looks like? Odds are you don't. And again, I'm not being critical. This is simply, we can't. In a world where portion sizes have been increasing for 3 decades or longer, we simply have no conception of what a normal meal is.
Portion is, yeah.
Right? The average restaurant will serve you roughly double or triple what you would normally eat by yourself. And they've done all kinds of things. They'll go out on the street and ask people, how many calories in a large pizza? People are like, I don't know, 400 calories? Yeah, try 4,000, right? One piece is 400. People have no concept of this anymore.
Yeah.
And as well as, and again, I hate to generalize, but I think in as much as women are frequently the ones doing the cooking and doing that, people think, oh, a little nibble here, a little thing here, I'm tasting, I'm this and that and the other. And people Or they think, oh, that little bit of cream in my coffee doesn't count, that little bit of sandwich spread. It adds up enormously and until you track that, I mean, writing it all down, measuring it, you truly don't know. You probably think you're eating much less than you actually are.
Well, and this practice could actually help. So one of my next questions was, how does somebody know when they're not a responder to kind of phase out? But to your point, if we were to establish these two habits of getting an appropriate protein, tracking calories, if you know prior to the medication, you're consuming, let's just say 2,000 calories, right? And you are now at what I would say maybe full dose of medication, and you're still consuming 2,000 calories. Would you agree that would probably be somebody who would not be a responder to the medication?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think in the book, that would be one. So in the studies, it would go, oh, you're not losing weight. But if they're not, that's because they're hoping that the compounds will simply suppress appetite spontaneously. And they do. I mean, the CEO of Novo Nordisk came out last year and said, yeah, on average, tirzepatide suppresses calorie intake by about 800 per day. That's it. Yeah, that's a big diet. Of course, it causes weight loss. But the word average gives you an indication. For some people, it's significantly more. And that means for some people, it's significantly less. Now, with each new drug, with each new compound that's been developed, the number of non-responders has become much lower. What you typically see in the research is that for any given compound, as the doses escalate, the number of non-responders go down, which means that some people, for whatever reason, brain resistance, the way their system is wired, I don't know. Nobody knows yet. Some people need a higher dose to get the same effect. One person may get it at 1 milligram. Others may need 2.4. And speaking to that, a recent paper, because I also don't know how they set the doses. I mean, semaglutide is weird. 0.25, 0.5, 1. Okay, fine. 1.7, 2.4. Why? Yeah. Like, whereas the others, tirzepatide, 2.5, 5, 7, 5, 10, 12.5, like that one I get. But semaglutide seems random to me. Regardless, they tripled the dose of semaglutide. They took them to 7.2 milligrams per day. And they actually saw weight loss similar to tirzepatide. Now, I'm not saying that's an efficient way to do it, but it points out that with a weaker drug, a larger dose tends to get more people results. But with each new compound, you're seeing the same thing. So tirzepatide has, is a dual, it has GLP-1 and GIP. The number of non-responders is going down. But even then, as the dose goes up, with retatrutide, which has 3, GLP-1, GIP, and glucagon, it has the least number of non-responders. And the second to highest doses, it drops to 0 non-responders. So with each, and probably whatever comes next, we may get to the point that there are no non-responders just because of how effective that they are. But we're not there yet. And until we get to that point, like I said, with the early drugs, prior to liraglutide, and I think maybe some people responded so poorly that they gained weight because they kept eating, they were either eating more or figured I can eat whatever I want. So having those values, if you get to the highest dose and your food intake has not spontaneously changed, which, I mean, you're not consciously, deliberately trying to diet, you're still eating the same amount. Well, you're a non-responder. But, and that's the unfortunate reality. Hyper-responders may not have to worry about it. They just have to get enough protein intake and let the drug do the work. If you're a non-responder, you may have to consciously reduce calories. Now, then we might ask, well, if you're going to have to do that anyway, why use the drug, right? Like if you're going to have just diet normally, but I think what people will find is that, to an earlier point, it makes it easier for them to do that in a way they couldn't do before. Now, rather than becoming the cause of the calorie reduction, it's facilitating the person's ability to do it, especially as they get deeper in the diet, right? Going back to the substance abuse issue, when people try to come off of drugs of abuse, the earliest stages are the hardest, withdrawal and all of that, but it tends to get relatively easier over time. Again, I'm not saying any of that, this is easy, but as the person gets away from it completely, dieting gets worse over time. We know that the initial stages are relatively easy for most people, but by the 20-week mark, the body's adapting. You mentioned it with having to white knuckle through. Someone may have to do something like, okay, I'm going to start with some mild calorie restriction while I escalate the drug. Maybe it's not having any spontaneous effects, but at week 20, when it's having at least some effect, it will allow the person to either maintain or to continue to lose past the point that their body would be like, nope, we're going to drive hunger so much. So that's another potential. And they've done studies like that where they're like, we're going to diet them first for 12 weeks without it and then bring it in. And even one of the early liraglutide studies, they dieted them for like 12 weeks and then they brought in liraglutide or didn't give them anything. And of course, without anything, they regained. The liraglutide group continued to lose more weight and then plateaued and stayed there for the length of the study. So that is another potential and that may be necessary for many. It may take 4 or 5 dose escalations, or you might be lucky and it's number 2. But having that baseline, sorry, one more, and then I swear I'll be quiet. Having that baseline will be such an incredibly useful value. And you don't have to do it forever. Usually the minimum 2 weekdays, 1 weekend at least. Tracking for longer, you get to the point where you can, once you realize that, okay, you weigh it out and go, that's about 4 ounces of chicken. Well, then you can eyeball it better.
Yeah. And on the flip side of that, when somebody, if they did decide to titrate off, if they decided they feel like, okay, you know what, I've lost half my body weight, I'm feeling a lot better. If you already know those calorie values, then as you're titrating off, it's kind of a little bit of a security blanket because I think a lot of people are afraid of coming off of them because they don't want to regain all their weight that they've lost. So it's a way that you can keep checks and balances to know as you're phasing out. And that could be another way of using that same strategy on the backside. But one question I do want to hit you with before we wrap for today is my only issues with these medications has ever been really 2 things. One, the cost. I see it being super, it's very it isolates from the majority of the population because most people cannot afford $1,000 a month indefinitely to be on these medications. Absolutely. And then the second thing that is a concern of mine, and I'm sure most people, especially with all these new renditions of these medications that are going to be coming out, is we know quite a bit about Ozempic, more for a diabetic medication that's been researched, but for just people using it solely for obesity, we don't have 20, 30, 40-year studies. Like if somebody says, okay, no, I'm really going to go on it, stay on it for the rest of my life, I accept that. But we don't have those studies. I mean, based on the research you've seen, what's coming up for long-term studies specifically for weight loss with these medications? What are your thoughts around that?
So I think the longest study to date has been 4 years where they kept people on. And it did show, I mean, again, this is a profound piece of data. They showed maintenance over that time period when people stayed on. And that alone puts it, head and shoulders over the majority of diet interventions, right? We know that most people are starting to regain by year 1, and by year 3, 4, they've regained most of it. Like we know that, so that alone, but we don't have long-term data in that sense. And even when the Ozempic study, like a lot of the side effects, when you start to look at the meta, it's always associated with the older drugs, like the stuff with gastroparesis, and that it was liraglutide and dulaglutide. As we've gotten into more selective drugs, especially tirzepatide, you almost never see this, something about the second compound in there. It still occurs, but not to nearly the same sort of effect. But what'll happen over 10 or 20 years? Well, we don't know. I mean, is there any fundamental reason to think it would suddenly start having other negative effects? I don't know. But that ultimately has to also be weighed against what we know occurs with long-term maintenance of overweight and obesity, right? So like and this is like a personal choice. Like I like the fact you're like, like if you can do it, some people can do it without. Even in the research, there is a small percentage of the lifestyle group that loses just as much as the higher drug doses, but it's a tiny percentage. It's like 2% lost 20% of their body weight, and 16% with tirzepatide lost it. So it's not as if lifestyle intervention cannot work. You've seen it, the message that you preach, like there are better and worse ways to go about it. But for a majority, okay, so back to the long-term thing, there is the cost issue, and that is the unfortunate roadblock. That is where, right or wrong, some of the compounding stuff, I mean, the companies are trying to address this. You can get coupons that will bring down the price. At one point we had government hearings, because in other countries it's not like this. Over in Germany, it's like $57.
Yeah, like $100.
It's absolutely
yeah.
Because America is absurd. It's just the unfortunate reality of our healthcare system. But that's not going to change as much as you and I like. I would love for it to change, but it's not going to. Yeah. But for example, I want to say Novo Nordisk with tirzepatide, they are offering to send people vials rather than the auto pens, rather than the auto injectors. They will send you vials apparently with needles, because I think the auto pens is a lot of the cost, because those things are not cheap. Yeah. What are ultimately, one like four use things. Now, is the average person going to pull a dose with a needle and self-inject? I don't know, but they are trying at least to reduce the. But it is even so, even if it's $500 a month, that's a lot of money. Now, one thing to consider, and the paper again came out at the end of 2024, is that the cost of the drug is often offset by the reduction in food intake. And for some people, actually, the food intake went down so much, it offset the cost of the drugs completely.
Interesting. Okay.
And just as a side note, a lot of companies are seeing, like Walmart is seeing their profits go down because people aren't eating those kinds of foods. And of course, the food companies, I'm already seeing it. We're going to make GLP-1 appropriate foods. And GLP-1, like we're going to have the same problem as before.
It was like the paleo brownies and like the
low
keto
carb jelly beans and the Atkins, like we're going to have the same thing, because these companies are not stupid. They're having to pivot because that's just the reality of it. Because, in the same way that, in a sense, you and I, despite the messages that we've said for however many years, the reality is that these are a new part of the game, right? At least for you, pivoting in the sense of, and I wrote the book, I'm like, even if you don't use them, if you're a trainer or a coach on any level, you're going to have people that are, and you need to know what they do and what they don't do and what the person should expect. Like, that should be part of our job. And you had to make that pivot in the sense of, I need to know what's going on with these things so I can better help folks, and also to know if they don't need it, use. But anyway, so being able to taper off in the long term is obviously a way to significantly reduce cost. Now, in the research, what they do to see what happens is they go, all right, we did 20 weeks or a year, whatever. They said, all right, boom, you're done. Get out. We're going to take the drug away. And everybody regains weight, because of course they do. Hunger just jumps off the map when you take it down immediately. But again, late 2024 paper, they had a group slowly taper, but they did it according to their own schedule. Right. So you lower the dose and you see what happens. Did my hunger come back? Am I maybe 2 or 3 weeks? Maybe, I need to really lock down my lifestyle stuff. That is a place we're bringing in exercise, where we didn't touch on, we don't have time for it today, is that may be relevant at that point. There was one paper where exercise alone did help with long-term maintenance and building muscle and that. And obviously, but just to speak to that, would it be great if people started an exercise program before this? Yeah, but people with severe overweight and obesity realistically sometimes can't. It's just not physically tenable. But that's a way later in the game, once someone is down 15, 20 kilos, they may be able to do that to help with long-term maintenance. But they tapered it down over an average of 9 weeks, with some coming off completely. Now, it was like 20% of the total, but they were losing people to follow up. Like, the numbers of people reporting went down and down and down. But it did show that it's at least possible. But it has to happen gradually. Maybe you bring it down. It'll take about 4 weeks for the level to stabilize. Maybe even if you don't do it, you can do it one of two ways. You can take a lower dose weekly. You can take the same dose every 2 weeks. And it has the same same effect in the body. Or maybe you split the middle. Maybe you take the same dose every 10 days, and it comes down about 25%. Okay, see what happens. Does your hunger go off the map? If so, what can you do about that? Maybe raise your protein, more fiber. Exercise can blunt appetite for some people. Once you've stabilized and feel comfortable, try another dose reduction. Now, it takes as long as it takes. An average of 9 weeks just means some people did it in 4 and some people did it in 20. And this is really important. And this is a message I know you preach, and I really want people to hear, is you can't pay any attention to what works for anyone else. That someone was able to come off immediately, it doesn't matter. The fact that it takes you longer, it doesn't make you weak. We got to get away from this attitude. care what anyone on social media is self or misreporting because they want to make their life sound great, right? What works for you as an individual? Some people may be able to at least use a lower dose in the long term. Some may come off completely. One thing that this population did, and this is something I recommend even with diet interventions, people come off and they get a little bit looser with their diet. And I tell people, look, what do people usually do? They start to regain weight and they ignore it and they stay off the scale and they pretend it's not happening. And then suddenly overnight, they've regained 20 pounds. Like, no, I mean, I've done it. Like, we've all done it. I'm not judging. We knew it was going on, but we ignored it. And I tell people that I consult with, look, set an upper limit of weight gain. Say that if you are up 2% over your current weight, you're going to tighten it down. Because it's way easier to lose 3 or 4 pounds that you've regained than to wait till you've regained 20 and gone, oh my God, I spent a year doing this and now I have to do. But they did the same thing with the GLP-1s. They came off, and then if their weight went up actually about 1.5%, they go back on temporarily. Even that reduces the cost and the usage. Others have recommended switching to one of the older drugs.
I heard metformin was actually another, an obesity doctor had mentioned, even if you had to switch to like a metformin, it could be
phentermine, Contrave. There's a whole bunch of what are the third generation anti-obesity medications, which are A, way less expensive, and B, there's not going to be a shortage of them. So like, that's another possibility Now, again, some people may legitimately have to stay on for life until we get along. Once they get a once-a-year compound, it'll be easy. Just boom, go on, or if they can figure out a way to rewire the system. I'm not optimistic about that, but if there's a way to do it, $1 billion pharmaceutical company will figure it out. Modify the like, if it can be done, they're going to do it. You see that in the mental health realm, when they're starting to look at some of the psychotropic stuff that may literally be like rebooting the brain. Will that come about in our lifetime? I don't know. But there are options for being, again, I did a consult and I talked about this with her. She said, no, I'm going to be on for life. And I'm like, okay, that's totally legitimate. For her, she's dealt with this for 3. You try it, you see what happens. It doesn't work. You try it, like I said, maybe instead of you take it every 10 days, or you use it intermittently, or you try another compound, or you find that, hey, I was able to do this since I spent a year locking down these lifestyle changes. I've brought in exercise, which gives me a calorie buffer. I'm doing the right things. I know you've seen this with your clients. People are like, I'm always hungry when I diet. Go, try bumping your protein. And they're like, oh my God, I'm not hungry for the first time. Like, I had someone email me once and go, increasing protein is a life hack. They're like, this changed my life. That one thing, because it decreases hunger. There are strategies to try for long-term maintenance that may allow people to come off completely, or at least only needed it. And what I would tell people, and then we certainly will, I know you need to go, was, let's say you come off completely. The next 2 months, you gain a little bit of weight. So you go back on, you take it off. Assess what happened during those 2 months. What did I do or did not do? Like, again, look for those red flags, look for those roadblocks.
Your tracking recommendations come in full circle again.
Maybe, see what's changing, but also just see, like, again, we get a little bit looser with our eating. It's normal, but like, look at, and then, okay, you go back on for a month or 2 and take the weight off. And now you try it again. Change whatever mistakes you feel like you made initially. Now, maybe you go 4 months without needing it. Okay, you learned a valuable lesson. People also forget, and I'm sure this is in your book, which I unfortunately I never finished. Long-term maintenance is a skill. Everyone will have different strategies that works for them in the long term, but you have to, people still this idea, they go, oh, well, this person maintained and I didn't, I'm a failure. No, what they did doesn't matter. What their strategies are doesn't matter. But you have to keep track of what's going on.
Working for you. Yeah.
And that it may take repeated efforts. But over time, hopefully, using it intermittently if needed, you stretch out how long it takes. And of course, the longer you're doing that, the better your habits, the better this is getting locked down, where over time, maybe it takes a year. It takes what it takes. So you figure out how you can maintain in the long term without needing it at all. Well, or you may need to stay on it forever. It's just no way to know.
This is why I appreciated your book, because first off, I feel like we're all learning right now, right? Like, I think we can all agree. Doctors are, I just had a client, by the way, go to her doctor for her annual, and she asked to be increased on her tirzepatide. And her doctor's like, hey, this is the Wild West. We're all learning together. She's like, I'm fine with that. So I think if doctors are admitting that this is the Wild West and we're learning, and I think all of us that have been in this field now for a while in some aspect can agree, I think we have to stay receptive to learning new things as they become available, and realizing it's not one extreme or the other. It's not the Instagram, TikTok, crazy results, no effort, like it's just cascading off my body. But at the same time, it doesn't have to be the fear, doom, and gloom that everything's going to kill you tomorrow. We can kind of try to settle in somewhere in the middle. And I think your book did a great job on that, the GLP-1 Solution. So I just want to say thank you for writing it. Thank you for being willing to have this conversation and keep this educational for everybody. So that way we have a more honest depiction of the expectations and the process and what kind of to really expect from this.
Well, thank you. I tried. I did.
Yeah, no, I so appreciate that. Now, I'm going to include your book in my show notes. Is there anything else you want to share with the audience before we wrap for today?
Not really. I'd only say for people who know my stuff, this one is on Amazon for a change. I went ahead. I'm going to try. I tried that rather than on my website. I put it on Amazon, and also it's in Kindle. It's currently in Kindle Unlimited. It's $9.95. It's much cheaper than the rest of my books. I guarantee you, regardless of how much you think you know about these drugs, and this is not like I'm not trying to be smug or my normal self, but it's like I am known for I read every paper for a year. I spent a month trying to track down a minor mechanism of no actual relevance to finally conclude nobody knows, but it's just the way my brain works. It will truly answer any question you have about the drugs, whether it's how they work, the side effects, the practical application. Just as a random note, something that I can almost guarantee you no one but me has talked about. The fact is that women actually do typically lose better and more quickly than men. You ever heard anyone else talk? No, because it's just not out there. Why? Probably because women are generally lighter, and the same dose it increases levels in their bodies more. Men may need more, but there's also hormonal effect. Women on HRT get better results than women not on it. There's an estrogen effect. So any question you think you have, and a bunch of them you never even thought to ask, I guarantee it's 9 chapters of science, and then it's 18 chapters of practical application, including diet, macros, what to do when you hit a plateau, long-term maintenance, how to incorporate exercise, what type of exercise. I promise you it's all in there. And it's $9.95. So
yeah, it was very helpful. Yeah.
And if you buy it, please leave me a review so I can game the algorithm. So
awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Lyle. You have a great day. Okay.
You too. Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Be sure to visit halfsizeme.com. Check back often for your daily dose of inspiration, because you are worth it.
The information you hear on this podcast is for informational purposes only. The host is not a medical professional. You should always consult with your doctor, nurse, or other certified health professional before beginning any diet or fitness program.